Welcome to another episode of The Breakdown. We just had us a provincial election. There were some twists, there were some turns, some surprises, and a little bit of fallout that we're also going to have to deal with, not only in the short term, but also very much in the long term. To help us make a little bit of sense of all of that stuff, we are very fortunate to be joined again today by former MLA for 14 years, former minister, former deputy premier, Thomas Lukaszuk. Thomas, thanks so much for taking the time to chat with us today.
Thank you for having me again. I appreciate it.
So let's sort of, before we get into the fallout piece, what were your sort of big impressions about what worked for this campaign and what didn't work in this campaign for both parties? We'll start with what worked well from your eyes that the UCP did.
I think they were rather effective and successful in isolating Danielle Smith of the recent past from the Danielle Smith party leader. NDP has gone out of its way to highlight some of the ridiculous and atrocious things that she has said, advocated for, and mused about. And UCP argued, well, yes, but that's Danielle of last week, literally last week. Don't listen to that. Her views have evolved. She's now a premier, and she doesn't believe in that anymore. And somehow it worked. Albertans were willing to give her a pass. So that definitely was a successful campaign strategy for UCP. The second one that was very successful for them, even though both of them really speak to electorate, was basically putting a plug in Danielle Smith's mouth and keeping her out of the media for the last 3 days of the campaign, having no supplemental questions by the media, just having her answer as few questions as possible. And the strategy was there, and it was brilliant, was A, they knew that the things she stands for could get them in trouble, and B, she also will say unscripted things that could be ridiculous, that will get them in trouble. So they were actually fronting other candidates instead of the leader of the party for media purposes.
I'm curious, like one of the things that struck me, and I'm curious if you think that it's like foreshadowing, if it was just about, it's the last press conference, no one cares. Because the last media appearance that Danielle Smith did, where she answered questions, came a couple of days before the end of the campaign, and it included a few candidates that were, the odds were not forever in their favor, let's say. And those candidates didn't get, at least two of them didn't get elected. But what I found particularly telling about that press conference was when you take a look at who the first three questions went to. They went to True North, they went to the Rebel, and they went to the Western Standard. It seems like the UCP did a lot of leaning into, I mean, you can't legally call it their own media, but there is this apparatus that exists on the right-hand side of the spectrum. And it seems like a lot of the really negative campaigning, the UCP were very effective at utilizing those sort of media proxies, none of which I think practice anything close to journalism, for the record. But do you think that played into the successes for the UCP?
Sure did. They did the math. It's crass politics. They did the math, and they said, okay, we're not getting Edmonton, so screw Edmonton. We don't need to communicate to Edmonton anymore. We are not going to get parts of Calgary, the progressive, ethnoculturally diverse parts of Calgary, the middle, lower income parts of Calgary, so screw them. Let's focus on rural Alberta and South Calgary, where there is a solid conservative base. Let's talk to them. How do we talk to them? This is the best way to talk to them. So instead of mincing your words through CTV, CBC, and others, and podcasts like yours, why not just go hardcore to our base and say what we mean and mean what we say? So that's exactly what they did. So towards the end of the campaign, parties do internal polling all the time, so they know actually better than the media where they're at, seat by seat. And it was obvious that, and you look at trends, you do this polling every few days, and you look at trends, and trends were showing that there was just no way that they're going to win those moderate ridings. So they went hardcore and started utilizing, Rebel and outlets like that. I had a conversation with a journalist, mainstream journalist recently, and this is becoming a problem because it's very divisive. It's all about misinformation, and let's be frank. Media is the fifth estate. It's part of a democratic process. The public needs to be informed in order for the public to participate in democracy, and it has to be informed through a truly independent media source. I am firmly of the belief that the word journalist has to become a protected professional designation. Much like you can't call yourself a pharmacist, you can't call yourself an engineer or a doctor or accountant unless you are accredited by a self-governing licensing college. I firmly believe that journalism is so important right now in our society for the survival of our society, our civilization as we know it, that it has to become an accredited title. So any guy with an iPhone and access to internet from his mother's basement can't run around and call himself a journalist. There has to be a process of credentialing. And I know that heads are exploding. They're saying, oh my God, Soviet Pravda, only government media. No, I think just like doctors decide who is a doctor and accountants decide who is an accountant, it should be bona fide journalists deciding who is a journalist. And if Rebel Media meets their requirements, then let them be journalists. But there has to be some licensing of journalism because, knocking on doors, the stuff that people were telling me at the door that they believed it to be true. And I asked them, where did you hear that? And they said, on the news. And I said, it's just impossible that you would have heard something like this on the news. And then to realize that, well, yeah, but they listen to Rebel. They actually consider Rebel to be a news source.
Yeah, it's fascinating, especially with the Rebel, because the it seems like the Rebel, Ezra Levant, that whole crew, they're very, very good at putting on, sort of doing journalistic cosplay. But as we've seen in lawsuits in the past, Mr. Levant has been very, very quick to come out and be like, no, I'm not a journalist. I'm just doing commentary. And it's one of the reasons why, I mean, here we're very, very clear we're not journalists. It's in our bio. Please don't mistake us for that, because I think you're absolutely right. The harm that is caused when people present themselves as practicing journalism when they're doing content creation is very, very toxic to the discourse. And I think another thing that's important to highlight, if I just want to make sure that I'm understanding what you're kind of proposing properly, just because journalist theoretically could become a protected title, that doesn't mean that people couldn't still do content creation. It just means they wouldn't be able to use the moniker of journalist.
That's correct. If you want to be in the business of entertainment, that's perfectly fine. So outfit like Rebel can continue doing exactly what they're doing. I have no issue with what they're doing. Some of the stuff is offensive, and I wouldn't personally watch it. But there are many things that can be bought or rented that I wouldn't watch. But let them be. If there's an audience for that, and you want to pay for it, and you want to watch it, Mr. Ezra Levant is in a business. He's making money doing what he's doing. He knows that he has to agitate audience. Man bites dog, no story. Dog bites man, no story. Man bites dog, a big story. So he creates those stories to get a big audience, right? It's sort of like National Enquirer. Look at the front page. People buy it because somebody saw a Sasquatch in the forest and they say, "Oh my God, let's see it." So let him do that. That's perfectly fine. But nobody would argue that National Enquirer is a reliable, source of information. You buy it because when you're sitting in your doctor's office waiting to get in, it's fun to read. But you would never say, "I know this to be true because I read it in Enquirer." The problem is that some of these outlets purport themselves to be media, and people watch them as if they were journalistic, programs with integrity. And then also there was morphing. We saw what happened during the American election with Fox News, that they started to generate stories because they were tracking what people want to see. So they sort of stopped being journalists and became entertainers. All that has to be regulated, because it's frankly not fair to anybody. There are people out there who really want to know the truth, and they think they know the truth, but they simply tapped into an outlet that doesn't tell the truth, but simply entertains and is not explicit about it.
Yeah.
When you tune into some radio stations on Saturday mornings, they have infomercials, and they always say that the opinions presented by in this show may not necessarily be the opinions of the radio stations. That they tell you it's an infomercial, so you don't buy into it as if it was news. Same thing should be required of those outlets. Do what you do, but preempt it with a statement saying that what you're about to hear may not necessarily be factual. This is content that we have created, may or may not be factual.
Well, I think we've seen the damage that it can potentially be done when media outlets are allowed to present themselves as journalists unchecked, because we saw, with the Dominion lawsuit that happened in the States with Fox News, they were deliberately ignoring facts. They were deliberately presenting false information because it served a political interest. And to my eyes, there's nothing preventing outlets like the True North, the Rebel, or the Western Standard. And in fact, we've seen evidence from Take Back Alberta that they're pushing narratives through the relationships, the personal relationships that they have with at least one of those media outlets. So I think it's very difficult for Joe Albertan to be able to take a look at any of those outlets and go, oh, here's all of the complexity on the nuance in the background, and they're calling themselves journalists, so they must be.
Yeah. No. They're entertainers. They're also politically involved. You will never find a global CTV or CBC journalist reporter showing up at campaign offices and cheering, a given political party and campaigning for them. They have to be objective. These individuals are entrenched in the parties, and they're basically selling messages that are conducive to the party. But it's, the problem is that this isn't regulated. But the bigger problem is that someone who wants to be a premier or became a premier actually takes advantage of that, right? Because that again is a slow undermining of our democratic process. It's an abuse of a system, and she knows that at worst they're lying purposely. At best, they're just sort of misinforming and entertaining. So, what serious, self-respecting politician would grant interviews to outlets like that, knowing that now she is part of this, and she also is misleading Albertans by appearing on programs like that?
Yeah, I'm going to come back to that in a bit, but before we do, you lent the NDP your support. You campaigned for the NDP during this last election. What did the NDP do well, and what would you like to have seen them do a more effective job of?
Yeah, I've never obviously been a witness of an NDP campaign before. I ran against them in all my campaigns. So it was an interesting experience of being sort of on the inside as an outsider. And I wasn't in any decision-making process. I just volunteered myself without even asking, and did my bit. But it was an interesting experience to watch another political party and a different culture and how they do things. What they did well, first of all, they did a really good job highlighting Rachel Notley. She was their biggest asset. She still is their biggest asset. And they linked themselves. They hitched their wagon very well to Rachel Notley. I think that was quite well done. Also, what they did well is they costed out their platform, and they put out their platform. The problem is that in a campaign like this, not many people are paying attention to the platform, but they actually had a well put together platform. If anybody cared to read it. And I read it with a few of my former colleagues, and we all agreed that this was a progressive conservative platform. It was very moderate and very fiscally responsible. Frankly, by far more fiscally responsible than the UCP platform. It was fully costed out. Whereas, one has to wonder where UCP was hoping to get the money from to pay for some of the promises that they made. So they did those two things well. Where they did have a difficulty was breaking into that Calgary market. Southern Calgary was a tough nut for them to crack. And when they announced a 3% corporate tax increase, that made that barrier even more difficult to overcome in Southern Calgary. So that timing wasn't exactly optimal for an announcement like that. But overall, I have to tell you, there is something very unique about NDP campaigns. They have amazing volunteers. And these volunteers are true followers and true believers in the message. The only time I have seen this level of public engagement in a campaign where volunteers show up at the office and there is always food at the office because everybody brings some food and they really love the leader was during the good days of Ralph Klein. When I ran in 2001, we in the PC party had that same atmosphere. You know, campaign offices were full of volunteers. There was always food and all that. That's what the NDP campaign was like. It was actually fun to be part of because it reminded me of the 2001 campaign with Ralph Klein. So they have a lot to build on. And I think they solidified a good group of volunteers. And I was in several campaign offices. In many of those campaign offices, I would always crack a joke about, me campaigning for a first time, as an NDP. And a lot of people would come up to me and say, I'm also campaigning for a first time as an NDP. So they managed to attract a lot of volunteers into their campaign offices that never before volunteered for NDP. So they did well on that front as well.
I want to talk about the Rachel Notley leadership piece, because this has been something that has been hotly debated since the election night. There's no shortage of people who are saying, Rachel Notley made some incredible gains. They were able to pick up 14 seats. They were able to take out some of the UCP heavy hitters, even though it's by like a hair's margin. But as of today, which is, he double checks the date, June 3rd, Mr. Shandro, he's no longer in government. He's no longer an MLA. Same thing with Whitney Issik. These are some big names. So there's a lot of people who are choosing to focus on those victories. But at the same time, there's also a chorus of voices that are saying, "Hey, you know what? Maybe it's time." What do you make of that?
Well, I think both parties have reasons not to be happy. And if any party, and actually both parties have some reasons to celebrate. So let's start with UCP. They have to celebrate because they won the government. And in our system, in the Westminster parliamentary system, is winner takes all. You win or you lose. There's nothing in between, right? So they won, so they take it all. They get government. And they get disproportionately rewarded with the number of seats for compared to the popular vote. But that's how it works. No complaining here. So they can celebrate that. What they do have a problem with, and they will not tell you this publicly, but I am certain of the fact that this is being discussed in the back rooms, is first of all, how is it possible as a governing party to run an election and lose that many seats, particularly in Calgary? Calgary is a safe area. They lost seats that have been perennially conservative seats. So it's not that they lost number of seats in Calgary, but which seats they lost is really problematic to them. The second thing is they lost cabinet ministers, and some of them pretty high profile. Some high profile for bad reasons, but nonetheless, Shandro was a very high profile candidate. So they lost that. So they have to worry about that. They also have a leadership problem because I already hear rumblings that if Kenny stayed and he ran this campaign, they wouldn't have lost Calgary. They would have done much better in this election. And they had to hide their leader, and they have to tell people at the door, don't worry, the moment we win, we will get rid of her. So there's a promise that, will they deliver on this promise? So, they were running campaigns against their own leader. And then there was Brian Jean, who unabashedly throughout this entire campaign was running his own leadership race, endorsing candidates as if they were his own, acting like a de facto leader of the party. So how long is Danielle Smith going to stay as the leader? when they already at the doors told everybody that they are getting rid of her. So there are major issues within the UCP party, and as a sort of overarching takeaway is that they don't resonate with most of Albertans. A lot of Albertans stayed home. They didn't vote one way or the other, but they simply stayed home. Conservative Albertans. So those are discussions within the UCP. NDP, well, obviously they cannot be happy about losing this election. If there was an election to be won, this was this one, and they didn't capitalize on it. So that's something that they have to reflect on and ask themselves why. If you can't win against Danielle Smith, whom in the world can you win against? She probably is the easiest target to win against. So that is a big question. Where they can celebrate is they took on perennially conservative seats in Calgary. And, as I said earlier, if you win a seat by 7 votes or lose by 7 votes, the fact that they even came that close, Shandro should have won his seat by 4,000 votes. So the fact that they only won it by 7 is a miracle in itself already. They should have lost, NDP should have lost that seat. So they took on a good chunk of Calgary, and they need to celebrate that, and I'm sure they are. And they don't have a leadership problem. As I said earlier, in campaign offices and door knocking, and particularly at their rally at the end on election day, the level of support that Rachel has within the party, even from the candidates that lost this election, and that's a tough night for, when you lose an election, they are 100% behind Rachel. So it's Rachel's decision if she wants to stay or not. But if she chooses to stay, there will be zero pushback within the party for her, wanting to stay on.
Do you think that there was some challenge that existed for the NDP? I mean, two of the big, you've already highlighted that 3% corporate tax increase, which the UCP very quickly spun into a 38% increase. But the other big criticisms that have been levied against the NDP coming out of the election were that the UCP basically got started campaigning with their leadership race and just never stopped. And the NDP, back in February and March, there were columns that were being written where people were saying the NDP had this huge lead and they're not doing anything. Where are they? As well as the one of the challenges that it seemed like happened was, if you took a look at the signage, at least here in Calgary, that the NDP had up, almost all of it wasn't just like the generic branding, was attacking Danielle Smith. And to be clear, there's plenty to attack Danielle Smith for. But do you think they had a problem communicating? Their platform, their policies were good. And I would argue many of them were very good, but they seemed to not be able to communicate that because they were communicating so much, oh my God, Danielle Smith's the worst. Am I reading that wrong, or do you think people are reading that wrong, or do you think that was part of the problem?
Oh, I think that's right. I think that's right. First of all, they lost momentum after the leadership race. NDP took a break. They brought in their campaign manager late into the game, so they didn't have a continuous campaign like UCP did, for sure. They went very negative on Danielle, and like you said, hard not to, when the material presents itself daily. But they were not effective in getting their platform out. And like both of us said, their platform was actually pretty damn good. Well written, well put together, well costed out. But it was overshadowed by sort of character assassinations, flying back and forth. So this campaign was Rachel versus Danielle, not political platforms being juxtaposed. If this was on platforms and on sort of plans moving forward, NDP would win this election handily. But that message never really got across. So that's really unfortunate. But again, a lot of the things, I'm actually upset with Albertans, with Alberta voters, for not because they voted the way they voted, but because they simply don't care to read. They don't care to find out who their candidate is. Albertans vote in a very tribal way, and I'm partly to blame for that, because after 44 years of one government, conservatism became a cultural identity in this province. It's no longer a political affiliation like it is in most places in the world, where you support a party because they stand for something that you believe in. The moment they stop, you stop supporting them. Over here, it's almost like like your religious or cultural affiliation. People say, I am a conservative, as if they were baptized to be a conservative, and they refuse to consider any other alternative. And if you tell them, look, but these are not conservatives anymore, even some of us progressive conservatives can't support them anymore, they struggle. People struggled at the door. They had no idea what to do. They said, well, yeah, but I'm a conservative, I have to vote. And I had some heart-to-heart conversations with some of my former colleagues, where I could show to them what Danielle Smith said and does and wants to do, that actually was striking very close to their heart, because it was touching some of their personal issues. And I said, how can you possibly vote for a person who speaks like this about your child? And they would say, Thomas, I know. There is that was unfortunate. I'm sorry. Microphone, mic drop. There was one MLA whose child, a PC MLA of way back then, whose child is transgender. And I thought, well, there is an MLA who will have a hard time supporting UCP. No, supported UCP. There are a number of MLAs who are very much engaged in the Ukraine initiative. And not only did Danielle say pro-Putin things, but during the campaign, her candidates were coming out and calling Zelensky a war criminal. So I thought, okay, just there is no way in a riding like Vegreville, you can vote for UCP. This is crazy. They voted UCP. What is showing is this, that nothing really matters other than sort of tribal affiliation. They don't read the platform. They don't find out who their candidate is. This lady in Panoka, Johnson, I believe is her name, who compared transgender or LGBTQ kids to, excuse my language, but to pieces of shit in a cookie dough. She got 72% of popular vote, right? So I ask myself, do we blame her? Yeah, of course we blame her. It's a vile thing to say, and it speaks to who she is, by all means. But do we also blame the people that voted for her? Do they now legitimize what she says? Yes, they do. Don't say, no, I don't believe in that. Yes, you believe in that. If you voted for that, you believe in that. Or at least you're willing to overlook it because something else is more important to you. And I don't know what possibly could be more important to you. 2% lower taxes, that's more important to you. So, when I said that we need to have some very uncomfortable discussions, I think it's time to have those discussions in Alberta. I know Prentice said, look in the mirror, and he was villainized for that. And I didn't agree with a lot that Prentice had to say, but that one thing was actually the correct thing. It is time for ourselves to look in the mirror. We as Albertans have spun these mythologies about ourselves, that we're self-made, we're entrepreneurial, we don't need anybody, we don't need the rest of Canada and the rest of the world, we can do it ourselves, that we're the kindest, the most loving, the most altruistic people in the world, that if you get stuck in the snow, somebody told me there will be a farmer that will always come out and pull you out of the snow. These are mythologies, because same thing will happen anywhere else in the world. There's nothing unique about us. If you travel the world a little and listen to what people say, everybody says that about themselves. Everybody thinks that they're the best. But who are we objectively? What do the numbers say? You can tell me whatever you want me to think about you, but that doesn't matter to me. I will look at the numbers. I will objectively look at the scores. If you tell me that you win every football game and then I look at the scores and you lost every single game, it doesn't matter what you say. So I'm looking at the scores. And where I have candidates as vile as this woman, winning with 72% of the vote, where I have candidates, that don't even campaign, they just sort of absent themselves because they're going to win no matter what. Where I have people, sort of say vile things and they say, well, forget about this, but, what about our economy? I think this is what defines us. This is who we really are. I think voting patterns are the best report card on a society. We always say we get the government that we deserve, and we truly deserve this government, and we deserve it because this is who we are and this is who we voted for. So on Twitter, sometimes people always say, "Oh my God, whom are we becoming?" And I said, "We're not becoming. We are that. That's how we vote." If you go to a ballot box and you know that the candidate or the leader of the party you're voting for is vile, but you're willing to overlook anything because she isn't NDP or because she is conservative, and you will take anything in the name of conservatism or any other political affiliation, you deserve exactly what you're going to get. And the unfortunate part is that the message to politicians in Alberta has always been, it doesn't matter what you do. It doesn't matter how you misperform or how vile you are. Don't worry, we'll re-elect you. Maybe speaking a little out of school, but I've been doing this for a while and I will continue to do this. There was a candidate, a cabinet minister, a longtime cabinet minister in our PC caucus from rural Alberta. And he, during election, when the election was called, would always go to Mexico for those 28 days. And, in urban ridings, like in Edmonton, you door knock literally up to 12 hours a day, and you still skinned, I lost by 3, won by 5. That's how close elections were. This candidate would go to Mexico for 28 days. And his comment always was, I can only talk myself out of winning. If I don't show up, if I'm absent, don't show up to any debates, don't door knock, don't do anything, I'm going to win. And sure as hell, that candidate was one of the longest elected members in the history of Alberta legislature by never campaigning, because he was a progressive conservative, and that's how the electorate voted. And the electorate knew that he was absent, that he wasn't working for their vote, and they always voted for that candidate. So elections are as much a report card on political parties as they are on the electorate. And when New York Times writes a full-page piece about Alberta election in not favorable terms, I think it's time to stop and say, no, never mind this mythology. Who are we really? How does the world view us? We could be spinning stories about ourselves, but how does the world really view us? And the reason it is important, because obviously it's important to be decent and to be seen as a decent society. But if you don't care about that, if decency is not your thing, and you only care about your wallet, then let's talk about that. When New York Times writes about us in these terms, when I'm asked for interviews, and I do them, several of them during the campaign with major European news networks in numerous languages, how do we present ourselves to the investor market? Do you think companies want to invest in a province like this? Do you think young people, entrepreneurial, well-educated people whose world is the oysters, who can work and study wherever they want in the world, do you think they want to come and live over here? So do you think this is good, really, truly good for our economy? And the answer is obviously not. We are losing young people. UCP argues that we have an influx of people coming to Alberta. We do, but not the young, entrepreneurial, well-educated people. We have people coming over here to do the oil and gas work, and they come, and I'm glad they're coming. But the moment the price of oil drops, they'll go back to wherever they come from. But the young and entrepreneurial are not coming to Alberta, and our young and entrepreneurial that we graduate from our fabulous post-secondary institutions are leaving. And that is not good for our economic future either. So whether you think with your heart or with your wallet, it doesn't matter. What is happening and who we have become, not whom we're becoming, whom we have become, is not good for either.
Do you think that there's a shift in that? And I mean, the reason why I ask that is I don't think that there's any question, especially when we're talking about constituencies like Lacombe-Ponoka, who did choose to elect a candidate who has, and I mean, like, to be clear, the comment about the feces and the cookies, that abhorrent, also not the only alarming thing that that candidate had said during the campaign. So it's not like it was a one-off. She's got a bit of a brand on this. So there are for sure certain areas where it seems to be very clear that we got a problem here. But the sort of the two things that I keep going back to are A, the difference between the popular vote wasn't huge. And so there's a good chunk of Albertans who are saying, oh no, we're not okay with that. It's just they're concentrated in very specific areas. And the other sort of thing that I keep going back to is there was an extraordinarily powerful column that I read just a couple of days ago where one of the organizers for Pride in Lacombe Panoka was saying, you know what, it would be so much easier for me to move to Edmonton or to Calgary where I can be part of a strong community, where I know that I can be accepted for who I am. I'm not going to be judged or hated or frankly have to be afraid simply because of who I am. But if I leave, if everybody who has the ability to leave does leave these communities, then it's just the bigots and the kids who can't speak for themselves. How do we balance that?
Well, it's a tough choice, and I agree. Some of us just never give up, and we get beaten up, and we continue doing what we're doing, and I think that's the right thing to do. But frankly, we're not martyrs, and people have a right to live a fulfilling, happy life. And if you get to a point where you say, I'm tired of fighting this battle, there are places on this planet where I can enjoy myself much more, they will make that choice. And many are making that choice. And I don't blame them for it. That doesn't mean they're quitters. They did the best they could, and they sort of gave up. And that's fine. That's not losing. That's just simply accepting the fact that this part of Alberta's geography is not ready for progress. The problem is that I don't know if you noticed that on your social media accounts, but I thought I blocked a lot of people during this campaign. I must have blocked, I kid you not, about 1,000 people since the election, because some of the most vile now feel legitimized and empowered. They feel like they're the majority. They have their own premier right now. It's okay to say those things. Their excuse me, their abhorrent language carried the day. So they unabashedly are attacking now, and I worry what will happen to our LGBTQ community and other minorities now that this sort of bigotry is somehow legitimized. So that's something we need to be focused on. But the next thing that needs to happen, and should have happened a long time ago, and frankly should have happened during our PC government, but there always was a pushback. But let's talk about that, is electoral boundary review. And it will happen actually after this election automatically. In Alberta, it happens after every second election, no matter who wins or loses. And the problem is that in rural Alberta, when you look at the number of eligible voters, they have by far more seats than urban Alberta. So I'll give you an example. I just looked it up. A riding, I believe it is Peace River, has about 14,000 eligible voters, whereas an average riding in Edmonton and Calgary has an average of 30 to 35,000 eligible voters. So Peace River, actually, each vote counts double. Peace River, 14,000 people get to send an MLA. In Edmonton and Calgary, it takes 35,000 people to send an MLA to legislature. So it was historically argued that those ridings are so large geographically, to capture 35,000 people in Peace River, it would be half of Northern Alberta. And MLAs, conservative MLAs obviously, would argue that, oh my God, I would spend half a day in a car, seeing my constituents in some remote areas. And you know what? Maybe then it was semi-valid argument, even though federal MPs have ridings the size of a European country, and they seem to be okay with that. But now, especially with Zoom and with teleconferences and video conferences and video town hall meetings, which are now prolific, nobody meets in person anymore. Excuse me, this argument doesn't fly anymore. So we need a redraw of boundaries that is fair to everybody, which means every vote counts the same. Every riding plus minus 10% has the same number of electors. So everybody's vote is equal in weight. And what that would mean automatically is that we would probably lose around seven to eight rural ridings that would be added onto municipalities. The second thing that has been done, and this was politically gerrymandered. The other thing that is continuously politically gerrymandered is the division of small towns into two halves. So you will have a city like St. Albert, which could be one riding. They divide it purposely in half and add a large rural component to it, which then obviously changes the voting profile of that population. And there's no reason for that. So, I live in St. Albert. St. Albert is actually big enough to be one in itself, a riding. But they added Morinville and a whole bunch of rural Alberta to it, which really doesn't have much in common with St. Albert. It was politically gerrymandered, and you see that in Medicine Hat, you see that in Spruce Grove, Sherwood Park, Leduc, and many other areas. Normally, what boundary reviews should do is have the borders divided by communities that have common interests. So not only should they have the same number of electors, but they should be sort of monolithic in their interests. So the MLA that represents that community represents one cohesive unit and not, several others. So that will happen. Now, the review in itself is always subjective. Usually a retired judge chairs it, and some experts sit on the panel. The problem is that the recommendations come before a MLA committee, and that MLA committee always has the majority of government MLAs. And government MLAs like the system that got them elected in the first place, so they override some of the recommendations and keep status quo. So I can tell you, I've been a witness to MLAs bargaining, saying, "Oh, I want this town, but I don't want that town. Cut out this farm," and actually with a pencil, arguing what they should and shouldn't have in their own writing, because they know who votes what way for the next election, and that needs to be reformed. If votes were counted equally, weighed equally, not counted, weighed equally, NDP would have won this election, because Edmonton would have had additional maybe 4 or 5 ridings. Calgary would have had additional 4 or 5 ridings. That would have definitely made a difference. So this is not sour grapes. Somebody would say sour grapes. No, that is something that should have happened long ago, and definitely should happen now. And then elections will reflect truly the balance of population, so that you won't have the people of Panoka, sending an MLA, and then a larger number of electors in Edmonton has to, get more people voting just to send another MLA.
Do you think that the electoral boundaries, you're the first person that I've heard raise, and it could just be that I live in a bubble, but you're the first person that I've heard raise the fact that the internet and the platforms like Zoom have made politicians more accessible. And as you were speaking there, I couldn't help but think to myself of MLAs like Shane Getson, who regularly engage through platforms like Facebook. They regularly hold these town halls. They regularly go on different media outlets, I'll say cautiously. So there, and I think that one of the things that does sort of make that an interesting argument is we demonstrated for, 2.5 years, that you could do the business without being there in person during all of COVID. So that's a very interesting. I'm curious. My understanding is that currently through legislation, and of course legislation can be changed on a whim by the majority government, but through legislation right now, the seats are capped at a fixed number of 87. Do you think that should be removed, and that there should be an argument for 97, 107?
No, because that's not the problem. The problem isn't a number of seats. You're just going to make that problem bigger if the proportion of distribution of seats between rural and urban Alberta is the same. So all you're adding is extra 10 seats to urban and rural, and you haven't solved anything. All you now have is more politicians, which costs more. And most Albertans don't know that, but in a province of 4.5 million people, we have several thousand elected officials, school boards, counties, city councils, and MLAs and MPs. There's actually several thousand elected officials already. We probably are the most governed jurisdiction, maybe not in the world, but in many parts of the world. We don't need more politicians. What we need is a true democratic process where the same number of people get the same number of MLAs. It's proportional representation, and my vote in Edmonton or in St. Albert should have the same weight in choosing an MLA as the guy in Peace River. Right now, my vote is worth 50% with its power to send an MLA to a legislature compared to a fella in Peace River. So that's all we need to do. I would say we actually have too many MLAs. If there was a way to decrease from 87 down, nothing would happen. But the reason we grew to 87 was because of geography. And that argument carried those days. That, I remember there was one MLA, I believe it was Hector Goudreau. He was a cabinet minister in the PC caucus. In his riding, to get to some of the communities, he actually had to drive to British Columbia and through British Columbia re-enter his riding to get to certain communities because there was no direct Alberta highways. And those days, I sound like an old man, but this is pre-Zoom era, 2001 to 2014. Video conferencing wasn't, as mainstream as it is right now. So you had some sympathy for that. And they would argue you can cross your riding in 20 minutes. My riding, Edmonton Castle Downs, for sure. I have to drive for 5 hours to get across my riding. I get it. But right now, nobody drives 5 hours across the riding. Most MLAs and MPs meet with their constituents electronically. Constituents no longer expect MLAs to be there physically. So this argument right now is just purely a political argument. True review of boundaries should happen. And if you brought all ridings to a mean average of 30,000 voters, that in itself would solve the problem.
Yeah, that's very. I've seen, like I said, quite a few of these debates going on social media about we got to fix the voting thing, and that is the first time I've heard anyone say, no, we have the tech to do this. We should just be doing it. So that's a very interesting argument. What are the other things that you're watching for? I mean, we have Danielle Smith is the premier. She's going to remain the premier. She's going to ostensibly put together a cabinet. The bench on the UCP side, there's not going to be, unless she goes ahead with her Council of the Defeated or whatever Game of Thrones title we're putting on it, there's not going to be any representation for Edmonton. There will be minimal representation for Calgary. And even when you look at the bench strength for some of the larger ministries, I mean, I'm sure that somebody like Rajan Sawhney is probably going to end up in energy or healthcare. But when we take a look at something like the Ministry of Justice, there's been quite a bit of debate around that because you only have 3 people who have any experience in law. Brian Jean, who's not a practicing lawyer anymore. You've got Mickey Amory, who has had some problems.
And just got admitted to bar. He just graduated from law school very recently.
And then you've got Jason Steffen, who has some views on some things. How do you see Danielle Smith navigating that? Does she just throw it to Amory and say, please don't be a Shandro and a Madu? Or could we potentially be seeing a justice minister who has no background in law?
Well, you don't technically, excuse me, I'm under the weather. You don't technically have to be a lawyer to be a justice minister, as long as the deputy minister is a lawyer. But it really makes it awkward because it is the justice minister that is the chief legal counsel to the chief justice of Court of King's Bench. So it really creates a lot of problems when your justice minister is not a lawyer. So she likely would choose one of those 3. The problem is, like you said, they're rookies, and a justice minister is a pretty complicated job. And every time we had a rookie justice minister, with Jonathan Dennis and a few others, it always has been a problem. They simply don't have the gravitas that it takes to be a justice minister. A justice minister is sort of a senior lawyer, respected in the legal community position where they look up to the justice minister. Justice ministers historically became judges because they were the sort of the godfathers within the profession. Everybody trusted them. They were the wise men of the profession. Now when you have people who graduated foreign law schools, and now Law Society loosened up the rules actually to become a lawyer, which is another story for another subject. But you have foreign graduates from questionable law schools, and then you have rookies who just were admitted to the Law Society becoming justice ministers. It's a little insulting to the legal community, to the real lawyers out there who've been practicing for many, many years. So it's a problem. But aside from justice minister, any premier will tell you that putting your cabinet is probably one of the toughest decisions you have to make as a premier. And that's even when you have a good slate of candidates to choose from. Danielle doesn't have that privilege. So Edmonton will be a problem for her. She will probably utilize some of the MLAs in the donut around Edmonton, Spruce Grove, St. Albert, and Sherwood Park, to fill in the gaps. But if you're an Edmontonian, it's hard to argue that someone from Spruce Grove is representing your interests. It's sort of a bit of an insult to Edmontonians. Now, she made it clear already, first day on the job, and she blows it. Instead of saying, well, I'm going to develop a good relationship with Mayor Sohi, hold her nose if she doesn't like him. You're a politician. You don't get to choose who you like and who you work with. The electors told you who you're going to work with. I'm going to work with Mayor Sohi and the city council, and we're going to develop a good plan for Edmonton. No, she decides to insult the mayor and the council, and it says that she's going to go to her council of losers, which wasn't exactly a first step towards making amends with Edmonton after Edmonton just showed you out the door. So there's a problem with Edmonton. Now, her rural candidates, there are some nice people over there, I'm sure, but there's some major portfolios to be filled, and most of them have zero experience. So this will be an interesting cabinet. For the sake of Alberta, I really hope she has a decent cabinet. We live in this province and we want them to make good decisions. But I tell you, slim picking. Now in Calgary, Calgary will be fine because she has enough MLAs over there to represent the interest of Calgary. But that further widens the schism between Edmonton and Calgary. Edmonton and Calgary are competitive, and when you have several ministers in cabinet from Calgary and none from Edmonton, that's a real problem. Prentice appointed 2 cabinet ministers who were not elected. As you remember, former Mayor Mandel became a Minister of Health, and he wasn't an MLA, and then he ran him in the next election. She has that option to appoint an unelected cabinet minister. Our system allows for it, but then there's an expectation that cabinet minister runs in the next available by-election. I'm not sure if she's going to go there, but that would be an option.
Interesting. I mean, it's fascinating to me because, even the internal politics with 2 of the potential lawyers that she has to, or people with legal experience that she has to play with. I mean, it blows my mind that I have to say the only reason why Danielle Smith was unsuccessful in interfering in the administration of justice is because Tyler Shandro said, no, you can't do that. That's a whole thing in and of itself. But when we take a look at Brian Jean, as you pointed out earlier, he's running his own leadership campaign and has been for quite some time. So for Danielle Smith to elevate him to a position of justice minister, that's a little bit risky.
Mickey, Brian Jean has been sending private messages. I have one of them. About her departure as a leader and next leadership race. So he's not even bashful about that. But there is that saying in politics that keep your friends close and enemies closer. Having Jean in cabinet and keeping a close eye on him and keeping him as busy as possible so he doesn't have the time to run around the province and run a leadership race could be one political strategy. I don't know if I would put him into justice necessarily. It's a pivotal position and he can cause her a lot of trouble. And I think he wants to see her get into a lot of trouble. So that may not be a wise move. I guess Mickey would be the other choice. I know Mickey's father really well. He and I, Moa Mary, sat side by side. Our offices were next door to each other for a number of years. a very fine gentleman. I can't say much about Mickey, don't know him well personally. The only problem with Mickey is he simply doesn't have the gravitas. He doesn't have the legal experience to be a justice minister, and it would be unfair to Mickey. He will have to confront judges and senior counsel, and be able to carry a conversation with them. And it's just it's just not fair to put somebody this junior into such a senior cabinet position.
Do you think there's also a concern with Amory? I mean, one of the big scandals that erupted before the election was actually kicked off was Danielle Smith announced her ministry or her council for inclusion and multiculturalism, and immediately after that, one of her appointees had to step down because of a history of making anti-Semitic and Holocaust denialism posts on social media. That individual was shown in a picture with Mickey Amory on election night. So is there a question of judgment, or is it just like, oh, you can still be friends with people?
Well, you shouldn't. You don't have that privilege as an elected official to just be friends with people. Unfortunately, if it isn't your personal value not to be friends with racists, then definitely as an elected official, you don't have that privilege of continuing such friendships, right? So it was just poor judgment on behalf of Mickey. I would like to think that he's not racist, but it was definitely a poor judgment on his behalf. Also from his campaign came a doctored up, photoshopped tweet that as if Rachel Notley made that tweet, and she didn't. And I tell you, that tweet was circulated in the Muslim community. It basically purported to say that she said that the moment she becomes a premier, she will shut down all Islamic schools. Or defund them or something like that. Well, she never put out this tweet. It wasn't her tweet. They just photoshopped one and made it look like hers. That was also from Mickey's campaign. Mickey will have to explain that. But like I said earlier, it doesn't bode well for being a justice minister for sure. A justice minister, Dave Hancocks of this world are good justice minister. Ron Stevens was a good justice minister. Those are fellas that become judges later. Those are fellas to whom lawyers turn and seek their counsel. Those were good justice ministers. When you have 20, 30-year-olds that just became lawyers, that just doesn't bode well for the government and for the province and for the justice system.
You talked about the polarizing. It was very clearly a political tactic, especially towards the end of the election, to try to use people of Islamic faith as a bit of a wedge issue, because we saw that fake tweet that was circulating and being circulated through Muslim communities. We also saw Danielle Smith come out with a fascinating series of announcements where she talked about the importance and her commitment to ensuring private schools still receiving public funding, charter schools still receiving public funding, religious schools still receiving charter funding. And then she took what seemed like was a bit of a shot at you, sir. What did you make of that announcement? Like, I would have loved to have been in the room to see your expression when Danielle Smith was like, you know what we need in Alberta that we don't have? Halal financing.
I chuckled. It was the best thing that ever happened to me, actually. I think it was obviously, I've been getting under her skin because she went there. And I chuckled because it was just a non-announcement. We have halal financing. We're the only province that has. My company is going national this year. We worked hard and we've been very successful. So there is halal financing through Canadian Halal Financial Corporation, and Muslims know that, and they come in droves. For her to make that announcement was a little silly. Without a doubt, but what it did is it drove traffic to our website like you wouldn't believe it, and we started getting a lot of applications from clients that haven't heard about us. So I have to thank Madam Premier Smith for promoting our business, because it actually turned out to be a good thing. Um, it all speaks to a bigger picture. Again, no wonder um, we have eruptions of racism and xenophobia and all that ugly stuff, when it is okay for politicians to play politics of identity during an election. And it started. Harper actually ran a campaign on hijabs. Then he wanted to institute a 1-800 snitch line for culturally, what was it? Culturally,
Eric practices.
yeah, that's right. So that was an anti-Muslim campaign in the last 2 weeks of his campaign when he was losing. And Danielle Smith started doing the same thing. She was basically scaring Muslims that the other party is going to defund your schools, and that I am the best friend with Muslims. And she was very careful with where she was promoting that, because her base wasn't very happy with that. Some of her call them rednecks that support UCP weren't happy with that at all. So she was very selective where she was saying what. But to go to a vulnerable community like Muslims and scare them that I'm your savior, and unless you vote for me, you're going to lose everything that's dear to you, is simply patently unfair. Rachel Notley was in government for 4 years. The Islamic Academy in Edmonton was in the NDP education minister's riding, and it's still there. It didn't get defunded. So to take a community that is already vulnerable and to scare them is simply not fair. Why? These are Canadians. They're voters. Many of them are born and raised in Canada. Why would you single them out and go after them? That's just pathetic. But that's the kind of a campaign she ran.
What are your thoughts? Like, one of the themes that we've kind of talked about today has been this. I'll use the same term that I used on our last episode, this encroaching bigotry, this encroaching hatred, where, as you pointed out there, Danielle Smith decided to use the fears of some members of the Muslim community to try to drive herself votes, and at the same time inflamed the hatred of some of her base. It seems like when you look at the UCP side of the bench, which is the government now, still, the condemnation for hateful rhetoric seems to be the bare minimum and performatory at best. And that seems to be setting the tone for some people. And to go to your point about the social media and the blocking, some of the tactics that we experienced here at the breakdown during this election were shockingly vile. And I mean, the month before the election, I think the block list for the breakdown was about 27 people. It was 27 accounts over 4 years. It's probably in the thousands now, because like literally every time one of the people who has the keys to the account logs in, there's 20 to 30 that we gotta boot out of there, because they are literally using hate speech. They're literally inciting violence. How do we, when we have a government that refuses to condemn that with any sort of passion, with any sort of conviction, how do we navigate that going forward, do you think?
Well, not only are they refusing to condemn that, but they're part of it. I have blocked now several thousands of accounts, and I always take a peek at them, who they are, and many of them are oddly created at the same time. These are paid for UCP accounts, without a doubt, bots. So they're not only are not reticent to in any way condemn that, but they're actually running those accounts. Those are, to a large extent, those are their accounts. And that's just unbelievable that this would be happening in Canada, anywhere in Canada. The second problem, as you indicated, is that they're very careful not to offend those people. Those are their voters. That's their voting base. And by winning now, the level of ugliness on social media right now has, quadrupled. There are accounts that are now sort of saying out loud maybe what they were thinking before. And so on June 1st, the Pride Day, it never happened before. I kid you not, probably 25, 30 teachers whom I never have been in touch with before contact me through a variety of means, saying that for a first time ever, their classrooms are half empty. Parents kept children at home on Pride Day. What do we do? And I imagine they reach out to me because I'm a former teacher, former education minister. It's hard to answer that question. But all of a sudden, parents who would have sent their kids to school didn't. Why? Well, because they're empowered. Leadership matters. What leaders say matters. And the amount of power you have as an opinion setter, as a premier, is not to be taken lightly. And when a government that is known for these kinds of views gets elected, this gives an extra jolt of energy to some, haters, call them whatever you want. Some are not haters, some are just uninformed people, or just not willing to accept any change, people who are not willing to accept anybody who's different than them. Call them as you want. The tag doesn't matter. All of a sudden, the message to them was, there's nothing wrong with the way I am. Now I have a premier like that. Now somebody finally understands me and listens to me. Now it's finally okay for me to say things that I always wanted to say because I'll get protected. I have a premier behind me. I matter. What I say isn't fringe anymore. And that's what populism is all about. That's what Trump created in the United States. Trump did not create, or Danielle Smith did not create, ugly people with ugly views. She just allowed them to raise their hand and say, here I am. Those people were always around us. Those were always our neighbors, but they would never say those things to us because it wasn't popular. Now it's popular. So they're saying those things. And that's the troublesome thing. Because, if you have some ugly views and you keep them to yourself and you don't act on them, too bad that you have to live like that, but be it. But if you now feel empowered to act on them, and you think that it is now mainstream and it's okay to be expressing those views and acting on them, that's when trouble begins. And unfortunately, we are now in an era in this province where those things that were kept quiet and to themselves are now vocalized and acted upon.
It's stunning to me that Smith doesn't seem to have learned anything from her whole Artur Pawlowski experience, because as was clearly spelled out in the Ethics Commissioner's report, Smith was afraid that if she didn't do what Artur wanted, he was going to embarrass her with a press conference. And that was the crux on which the Ethics Commissioner was able to say, yeah, no, she violated the Ethics Act, because if she hadn't said that part, she didn't have anything personally to gain from it. But because she was very clear that that's what her motivation was, and it's stunning to me that she hasn't figured out that perhaps being beholden to bigots isn't great. But the question that I want to ask you is, do you think that the fact that we have this leadership void that is emboldening these views, and I want to be clear, not to say that it wasn't important before this, but do you think there's a greater importance for people who aren't the Premier of Alberta to call this out when their neighbors say the bigoted or the hateful stuff? Does it just make it all that more important for the everyday average Albertan to say, not on my watch?
Most definitely. As a matter of fact, those of us who don't subscribe to those views and attitudes need to work harder. That's all there is to it. I hung out a pride flag at my house yesterday. And in my neighborhood, actually, there were always about 5 or 6 just within one stretch of one block. Now there are 2. I'm going to keep watching if the number of pride flags goes down. But the thing is, we need to do that, and I know it's difficult to do, and I can't ask anybody to do it because it's difficult to do. And maybe even there is some element of danger attached to this. So I would never ask anybody to do it, but I can tell you how I conduct myself. Every time I hear, and no matter who it is, saying something that is offensive, that is demeaning to a minority group, that is untrue politically. It's just spun out misinformation. I confront it immediately, and I don't care if it's my family or my friends. I will stand up and say, not true, or that is horrible, that is wrong. How would you feel if it was your child? We need to find that courage, and if more of us were doing it, there is nothing wrong with shaming people for doing those things and saying those things. We need to make this province uncomfortable for those who have those views, and help them and educate them. Not just shame them, but educate them. Say, why don't you read this? Why don't you look at this? Have you ever actually slowed down and thought about this? Is this really who you are? Because I'm finding that a lot of individuals, and I run into them in my circles, they repeat things, but they never actually slow down and thought about it. This sort of F Trudeau. I say, okay, well, tell me why. And then they don't really know why. But that on the job, that's what all the guys say. So they're one of the guys, and that's what they say too. So, it is incumbent upon all of us to confront it, to question it, to challenge it. I know it's hard work. I know it's uncomfortable. And we all have people like that in our families, that just go around and repeat stupid things. And we know them to be good people. And somehow they get caught up in this. But the fact is, there is that, that famous poem by a German Lutheran pastor. I can only paraphrase it, that, first they went for communists. I didn't care because I wasn't communist. Then they went for Jews. I didn't care. I wasn't Jew. And then they went for laborers. I didn't care because I wasn't laborer. And then they came for me, and nobody cared, right? So you don't only care when negative forces go after you. You care when they go after others, and hope that others will care when they go after you. And I think we have a fiduciary duty as citizens in a country to, when we see any group being marginalized in any way or taken advantage of for political gains, or where just misinformation is being spread to skew democracy, it's our obligation. It's not a nice thing to do. It's our obligation to say, not on my watch, like you said.
Yeah, to me, it always comes to one of the big things that it comes down to is, as much as when somebody says something that's hateful or bigoted or any of the very bad things, as much as it might feel uncomfortable for me in that moment to say, hey, don't be a dick for reasons, I have that choice. I have that choice to be uncomfortable. And when they drop these comments in front of people who are part of the groups that they're targeting, those people don't get that choice to be uncomfortable. And I think that it's critically important that more and more Albertans who do have that choice to say, you know what, I don't have to. This isn't hurting me personally. But I'm going to put some skin in the game here because it's just the right thing to do, and because I recognize that there are people who don't get that choice.
I agree, but it's really about decency, and and if we want to spin this rhetoric, how nice and great and wonderful we are as Albertans, let's start acting like this. You don't like Trudeau, that's fine. Don't vote for Trudeau. I don't ask you to like Trudeau. That's your democratic right. Read your platform. If you hate the Liberals, hate the Liberals. But do you have to have a sticker on your truck, with swear words? Do you need to promote? Not that you don't like Trudeau, but that you're an idiot. You really are an idiot when you have a sticker like that on your truck. Other kids are looking at this. When I look at a person driving a truck like that, I know the person is an idiot. That's all it really says. It says nothing about Trudeau. As a matter of fact, it's a point for Trudeau, because if idiots don't like Trudeau, that's a good thing, right? So, so it's about common decency. And when I see at school, parents picking up their kids at an elementary school and they have these stickers on their trucks, I'm thinking, really, is this who you really are? Are you proud of yourself? Do you think it makes you great? Do you think it makes you brave because you have some idiotic sticker on your truck? I wish we sort of sat back and thought about it. what does it really say about us individually and about Albertans? And when you go on Twitter and you set up a fake account with a fake name and you spew all this garbage, I don't care who you are, I'll block you anyway. But who are you? How um, undervalued are you really that you have to do that? What do you think you contribute? The problem is that those people always were there, and now they feel emboldened to do that. And I made a comment that if my staff at the office were to be pulling up with a vehicle with offensive stickers in front of our office, I would give them two choices. Either you park the truck off the company property or you're not coming to work. It would be that simple. And I don't care whether it's F. Trudeau or F. Notley. You're not parking a truck like that on my premise. That's all there is to it, for the respect of my business and my clients. There's a role also for employers to play. Places of employment are supposed to be respectful to everybody. We need to start looking at, what kind of rhetoric takes place on job places, what kind of trucks are parking at our properties. There are Muslim people working in the oil and gas industry as well, and they're big oil and gas people. Most Muslim people have been born in Canada. It is actually the fastest growing community in Canada by birth, not by immigration. They don't need to listen to this garbage on the job. So it's a challenge to all of us as individuals, as employers, as educators. We can put an end to it, because obviously our premier won't.
To me, it always comes down to, like, when I see those stickers, the thing that is always most striking to me is there's two fundamental flaws with them. They're not attacking the ideas, they're not attacking the policies, they're not attacking the positions, they're attacking the person. Like, if you have an F. Trudeau sticker on your truck, you're not answering the fundamental question, why? But the other thing that drives me nuts about them is they're fundamentally not clever. I'll be the first to admit that I've got a I Love Alberta Bigfoot sticker on the back of my truck, but it's clever a little bit. It's a little bit funny, and I know the guy who made them, and so that's a little. But it's also not attacking a person. It's not denigrating a person. It's saying it's satire, and it's saying this is stupid. And I think there's a big difference in how the argument is approached, and I think that's part of the problem as well.
Those stickers, much like the truck nuts, they compensate for other deficiencies. That really is it. Mostly guys, they think that it makes them somehow macho, somewhat dangerous, vigilante, and that somehow people will even be scared of them a little if you're driving a big truck with nuts and a F. Trudeau sticker on it. I laugh at him. I'll tell you a story very briefly. When I was a Minister of Advanced Education, there was a professor from University of Lethbridge that anonymously used to write me poems and send them to my office. And I have to tell you, they were exceptionally well-written poems, except they were very offensive to me as a person. He was targeting me as a person. So they were just nasty, nasty pieces of really good literary work. So I enjoyed reading them. But they were just offensive. It so happened that one day I was delivering a speech at the University of Lethbridge, and someone knew who the author of those poems was. He probably was bragging about it to his friends. Look how brave I am, So somebody came up to me and said, "Hey, by the way, do you want to meet the prof who's writing all those poems?" I said, "Damn sure I want to meet that prof." So I was led to that professor. And I said, "Doctor, I understand that you're the one that's sending me beautiful poems, once every few weeks." And this man started shaking like a leaf. He was honestly scared. And I said, "Why are you scared?" And he didn't say anything. I said, "You know what?" I said, "First of all, I'm not an expert on poetry, but I think it's pretty well written, good poetry. But I wish you had the fortitude to pick up a phone and tell me what you think, or at least sign those poems, identify yourself so we can engage in a conversation. Maybe you have something that you want to share with me. Maybe I could have learned from you. But sending me nasty poems and not even signing them, that's not doing anybody good. And this is more about you than it does about me." The poems ended. Much the same with those stickers. If you were to talk to many of those people, they're probably nice guys. If you were to give him information and sit down with them one-on-one and say, well, let's look at the facts. What about this and what about that? Maybe you would never convert them to like Trudeau, and that's not my goal. But maybe he would peel off that sticker and realize that it's just stupid, and it just makes him and his family and his spouse and particularly his kids in the back of the truck look horrible with a sticker like that. So I guess all I'm saying in all this long diatribe is that let's become decent, right? Let's become decent. Let's argue about policy. I go after Danielle Smith and used to go after Kenny on Twitter like there's no tomorrow, and I will continue to do that. But on policy, right? You will never hear me say anything bad about her as a person, or you will never hear me say F Danielle Smith, because it doesn't contribute. I will point out the fallacies in her thinking, in her past thinking, and in her policy development. But these personal attacks, they just have to end. And once we focus on policy, half of the people on Twitter will drop off because they know nothing about policy. They don't read policy. They just get high on sort of ganging up on an individual. They are bullies. That's what people do in junior high school. And cause a lot of harm because they will just continuously attack a person for who they are.
Yeah. Mr. Lukaszuk, you have been extraordinarily generous with your time. I know you're under the weather. I want to give you just the last couple of minutes. Floor is absolutely yours for anything that you wanted to touch on that we didn't touch on.
Well, first of all, I wanted to tell you at the offset, our first interview we did a few weeks ago before the election, and don't think I'm saying it to you because I'm talking to you, but in all my years in politics, seriously, in all my years in politics, I must have done thousands of interviews with many, many, many networks. I have never had this many people contact me and come up to me and say, I saw this video that you did, and thank me for it. So you have good listenership, and your program gets forwarded from person to person because I don't know what impact it had on Albertans, but I can tell you a lot of Albertans saw it because they were coming up to me to tell me about it. So whatever it is that you built, be proud of yourself. Congratulations, because it is penetrating the market for sure.
Well, I'm terrible with compliments, but that's very kind, sir.
Just take it. Last few minutes, I literally hope that we move forward on matters of policy. I really wish us for the next 4 years that we drop assassinations of personality, but go, after past and current and future policy development. I believe that if we have an electoral reform that is properly conducted, there is an opportunity in the next election to correct some of the errors. I think NDP has a lot of potential for growth. I do think that NDP has a branding issue that they need to address. Those 3 letters NDP are really turning off a lot of voters in Alberta. They like Rachel, they like their platform, but they just can't find it within their heart to vote NDP. So that's something that I think they have to deal with. I think we may be a 2-party state for a number of years to come. Alberta Party has collapsed. And that's unfortunate because usually it's good for a jurisdiction, especially in our political system, excuse me, to have 3-4 parties at play, but that won't happen. So politics will be interesting in this province, but most importantly, we actually need stability at this point in time. We live in a very unstable world. We have never been, probably since the Cold War, we have never been in a more unstable environment politically as we are right now. And this is time for leadership. This is time for people to step up and deal and lead with courage and character. And I'm expecting that from Danielle Smith. Her first day wasn't good, relevant to Edmonton. It didn't show statesmanship at all. But, I'm willing to give her a chance, for sure. I will be hard on her. I will be not giving her any easy points in my commentary, but anybody can redeem themselves. But let's watch.
There we go. Thank you so much, sir. I really appreciate you taking the time to have this conversation and sharing some very important insights.
Thank you so much. Pleasure.
And that's it for another episode of The Breakdown. As always, if you appreciate the kind of content that we're trying to produce here, we would love nothing more than if you thought about signing up to be one of our Patreon sponsors at www.patreon.com/thebreakdownab, where for just the price of a fancy cup of coffee a month, you can help us continue to produce this kind of content. Whether you're listening to the audio version of the podcast, in which case maybe leave a review and a rating, or whether you're watching it on one of our streaming platforms, we want to say a big thank you to everybody who is part of the Breakdown's audience. And as always, take care of each other and keep the conversation going.